Thanks very much for joining us today. Our guest is Major General Cameron Holt, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Contracting, the U.S. Air Force, the Department of the Air Force, really. We wanted to focus this session on lessons learned for the government contracting business from the pandemic. Just like in every business, I think a lot of challenges, but a lot of opportunities to do things differently or be forced to do things differently, really. And just for our viewers and listeners, one of the reasons I wanted to kick off this session with General Holt is that I think you've definitely been one of the most outspoken, reform-minded people inside the acquisition bureaucracy that I've ever heard speak on these issues. So, if there's anyone who'd be willing to use this as an opportunity to try some new things, I think it'd be you. I think the most logical place to start this conversation is kind of toward the start of the pandemic. Take us back to that time frame, maybe the March time frame, if you would. As this all started to emerge, I'm sure there was a bit of a fog of war aspect to it. But what were some of the most obvious things, some of the oh wows that came at you right away that you knew that you were going to have to tackle and act on?
Well, it's a good story, Jared, actually. And again, I'm so fortunate of the work that we have done leading up to the pandemic, because I will tell you, in Air Force contracting, we've been on a tear, a revolution, so to speak, as you mentioned, called mission-focused business leadership, where we have taken a ton of actions to push authorities down, kill all the rules that don't make any sense, that don't have any relevance towards the mission, really inspire some of our young folks to take risks, to innovate, and really understand the mission, and then apply their expertise in contracting to literally find the best ways forward, and not fear the DC recrimination culture as you do that. And frankly, I think it's been refreshing to see the response of that cultural change, and it's so necessary to great power competition. Back in March, we had no idea that we were preparing for great power competition, and setting contracting up as a leader in a leadership role as business leaders that make good decisions, but make them fast, and use all the tools in the toolkit, and then invent some where they need to be invented. And that culture, I would tell you, served us well. That day in March, I remember very well. It was the first day that I stayed home. A lot of people stayed home. And my boss, Dr. Roper, sent me an email, and he let me know that he wanted me to stand up an Air Force-wide, Department of the Air Force-wide acquisition COVID-19 task force to respond. And he needed that done really rapidly. And I sat in my living room, and I had my government-issued iPhone 6 on me, my trusty iPhone 6. I went to my computer and tried to hook up to the VPN, no joy, which was not unusual at that point in time. And so literally, we stood up an Air Force-wide task force with 4 lines of effort, each of which led at a very high level across the Department of the Air Force in 48 hours out of an iPhone 6. So that's the first indication I knew that we were going to be having to make things up as we go along. And there was going to be a lot of audible calls played, but we were ready to go. The Air Force has a lot of background in wartime contracting, but a lot of that skill set from my experiences after 9/11 and in Afghanistan really served us well as we sprung to action in response. When my boss said go, we were ready to go in under 72 hours.
You mentioned all the preparatory work that you had done, not knowing a pandemic was coming for great power competition. And I think it's fair to say probably one of those main things, to use an overused word, is you needed to get yourself ready to be agile. What were some of the specific things you did that you are glad in retrospect you had done when the pandemic started?
Yeah, so great question, Jared. So when I first became the head of contracting for the Air Force, my attitude was, well, I didn't promote me, so it's the Air Force's fault. What happens now? And we got busy, and we set ourselves in alignment, as I said, with the National Defense Strategy and great power competition. And I told my contracting workforce, in fact, the first thing I did as AQC was to really get together a threat briefing that I could take to every man, woman, and child in contracting. And for an hour, I would take them through a classified threat briefing of how serious this threat is, not talking a little, even 1 ounce about contracting. And because our people are great, but they need to be told why, not just the what. And then we set about standing up an Air Force Contracting Board of Directors. And we doubled their authority. Each one of those directors, we doubled their authority to $1 billion. And frankly, I've been delegating above $1 billion to them. And I asked each of them to be kind of like the presidents of their own companies, entrepreneurial instead of bureaucratic. And I gave them a lot of authority. We've pushed authority even below that level. We increased authority to the tactical edge, the contracting officer, by up to 10 times. And we set those as minimum authority levels, not maximum authority levels. And then over the last year, we proceeded to rip apart our Air Force regulations through something I called Operation Clean Sweep. And we deleted every mandatory procedure in contracting below the Air Force level, Department of Air Force wide, under an initiative called Tools, Not Rules. And then we pushed out new electronic tools, new data analytic tools to our people, along with the authority, new training in the business world, not just in contracting, but in balance sheets and cash flow statements and income statements, understanding venture capital, understanding private equity, understanding Wall Street. And that new business acumen and that new swagger, that new culture of being connected to the mission and literally hacking our own antiquated Cold War acquisition and contracting system to get to the mission faster and better and more innovative without fear. Those are the things that we set up that I think made the difference. And the COVID-19 response through the task force, which really engaged all of Air Force contracting, was really a graduation exercise. It was an early graduation exercise. But I will tell you, we passed magna cum laude, and I couldn't be more proud of the results.
Just on the piece about pushing authorities lower in the chain of command, that's obviously got its virtues, and I totally understand why you would do that. But it seems to me kind of the history of acquisition reform is those things move in cycles or waves. For a while, authority will get pushed back down, and then it'll get pushed back up to the Pentagon, usually because something has gone really wrong in Congress, right, or somebody gets upset. Do you worry that we're gonna that cycle will continue, or is there anything you can do to prevent that from repeating itself?
Yes, as a matter of fact, you can. When you do it as a management initiative or you do it for show, it's very simple to push authority down and be very sound very innovative and forward-leaning and all that. The truth of the matter is, if you really want it to endure, it's a lot of hard work. I mean, it is a lot of hard work because you've got to write it down, and you've got to be willing to burn what you're not going to use anymore. You've got to cut the bait. And so I joke around with my folks that I'm Cortez and I am burning the chips behind us. We are not going back. And so we, in that Operation Clean Sweep, for example, not only did we delete all hundreds and hundreds of pages of useless mandatory procedures that really served to just stop people from thinking and sucked all the authority and innovation out of the room. But we also even streamlined what remained, and we simplified it. And we developed new structures like the Air Force Contracting Board of Directors, and we gave them authorities. We did the hard work to actually write it down. I would say that it's not impossible for it to go back, because nothing is impossible. If we got leadership, for example, that really wanted to regulate and control and micromanage, over time that will happen by itself. But what we have done is make it incredibly hard to get there. And we have taken the shackles off of every man, woman, and child in Air Force contracting. And frankly, they're using that authority, and they are coming up with some things that are just amazing in terms of, but completely compliant in terms of how we do business.
What did you have to do, or what do you think you were successful in getting individual contracting officers down at that level to overcome the famous government risk aversion?
Right. So, another thing we skip, I kind of referred to this earlier, but the thing we skip as senior leaders sometimes is we think that our agenda or our leadership initiatives are so compelling that all we have to do is tell the workforce what they're going to do now. And we expect that they're just going to connect with that. I disagree. I think if you really respect the people that work for you, what you'll do is you'll go out of your way to explain the why before you explain the what. And that effort of going out and to appeal to Air Force contracting, to appeal to my family in Air Force contracting with that threat briefing, to show them how real that threat is from China and Russia, and why I think their knowledge, which really is second to none, of the details of how to turn dollars into fly, fight, win for the United States Air Force and the United States Space Force, why their skills are absolutely necessary to take a leadership role right now. And the fact is, if we don't lead, no one else can, because no one else is trained to the level that we are in the details of how to get things done. That was a big game changer, and I think a lot of our workforce just hearing that, and hearing me say that I'm going to be the blast shield for you. Honest mistakes are fine. Ethical mistakes are not. But honest mistakes are fine. If we lose a GAO protest, I'm not going to freak out. If we get our name in the paper, I'm not going to freak out about that. There are people paid full time to make that happen. And it's a fool's errand for us to try to avoid it. We will make mistakes. Any innovator is going to make mistakes, but we're not going to freak out about it, and we'll keep going. But to answer the question, I would tell you, I can say all of that. We can write it down. We've got a nice strategic plan called Mission Focused Business Leadership. We've got teams set up all across the Air Force, horizontally across all the stovepiped commands, changing the reality over time in 4 different lines of effort. We can do that, but it's really the actions backing up the words that I would say makes the most difference. I actually look and hope for those rainy days where we have made a mistake, or where a team wants to try something new that I may not even agree with, that I may think that it's not going to work out the way you want to, but I still let the team go and do it and see how it goes. Those are the actions where I'm willing to back up my words. And every leader has a say-do gap, what I call a say-do gap. They're saying one thing, but they're doing another, and they're not aware of it. Mm-hmm. And what I try to do is make sure that I expose myself to the accountability of the folks that I lead. And it's perfectly fine for them to call me out on any say-do gaps. And then I try to make sure that that is minimized. So it's the action behind the words, I would say, that really drives it home. But you can't avoid the why, and you can't avoid articulating the what clearly.
You've given us a pretty good flavor for some of the things that you did pre-COVID that you think put you in a good place.
Right.
What about the policy changes? And some of this came from the OSD level, but the Air Force, I'm sure, did some work in this space too. Policy changes that you did in response to COVID that you think were impactful, that helped get you through this time.
Right. So I think, and I have to take my hat off to OSD as well. The DPC folks were lockstep with us in moving out with the policy changes that needed to be made immediately. And so props to them. But I will tell you, we were moving out even ahead of them in some cases with policies that gave contractors the ability to determine mission essential activities. And that was one big deal, because as a lot of vital national security work had to continue, even in the face of local and state restrictions on movement, we had to provide some rapid definitions of what's mission essential, so that those contractors could work with their local authorities and still come to work and still produce with obvious precautions. That was one. Another was changing the posture of contracting policy from a peacetime context to a wartime context. And so we turned on all the contingency contracting authorities. So that basically brought, all of the flexibilities we would exercise on a battlefield into the continental United States. And that was really critical because we had to move really fast to save some industries and some companies that were immediately impacted by the rapid downturn of commercial air traffic, commercial aircraft orders, engine orders, and on and on. We sent a number of policy memos out too that were nothing more than encouragement, encouraging contracting officers and program managers to lean forward, to exercise every authority at their disposal. And some of those, I think, actually made a difference as well. And behind that, we saw a lot of rapid actions that I think in retrospect now really did preserve a lot of the defense industrial base that could have been far more impacted than they were. First off, with aggressive financing terms. DCMA worked with us and did a set of blanket increases in the progress payment rate that immediately impacted all fixed price contracts across the department. We aggressively negotiated performance-based payments to increase cash flow. And we even had some instances where we had to work with DPC to deviate from the federal acquisition regulation rapidly to do certain advanced payments that were very targeted and secured with letters of credit from the company side. But those wound up being game changers in retrospect. At the time, we were looking at all the financial data and all the financial downturn data, and we knew we had our full support of our leadership to go after every tool possible. And as the experts in contracting, we knew what those tools were, and we applied them aggressively and immediately. And I think that made a tremendous difference.
On the industrial-based piece, one thing I wonder is how satisfied are you with the tools that you have to monitor the health of the parts of the base that you really want to keep close tabs on? And along with that, you don't have unlimited money to use under the Defense Production Act or the rest of the tool sets that you have. How do you decide who really needs immediate assistance in a situation like this when there are so many companies in trouble?
Yeah, sure. And your listeners may not know, but the Air Force is actually the executive agent for all Defense Production Act Title III execution. I have to say this is another area where OSD really moved out quickly. They established an industrial base council in the Industrial Policy Office of OSD, and then as the executive agent, we teamed with them to establish that process, and all of the services and agencies are represented in that. To answer your first question, do we have the tools and the data that are necessary to really assess the defense industrial base? I'll answer that, yes, sort of. We as the executive agent have a great team of folks that focus on the industrial base all the time. And not just the industrial base that provides air and space capabilities, but also shipbuilding and all the joint capabilities as well. I had not had a lot of personal experience with that in my past, but when we set up the task force, a line of effort 2 was called resilience, and that encapsulated all the Defense Production Act activities. And some of the industry expanding contracts and agreements that we executed so rapidly, I was so impressed with how much we did know about the industrial base. What we did not know is what state was the medical industry in. We knew a lot about the defense industry. We didn't understand to a deep extent what the medical industry constraints would be. And we had to learn that very rapidly. But I'll give you one example that is just a fantastic example of where we applied what we did know to what we didn't. So we were asked to expand the production capacity for nasal swabs rapidly. And there's a little company in Maine called Puritan, small company, family-owned company. And incidentally, they make most of the swabs for the United States. And yet it's a family-run small business. And when we approached them with having to ramp up production to such an extent, they were really at a loss for how do they do that quickly? How do they create all the machinery and facility and plant and equipment that quickly to get moving? Our folks that work DPA knew all about Bath Iron Works that was just literally a couple of hours from Puritan. And we know everything there is to know about Bath Iron Works, even though that's typically a Navy contractor, not an Air Force contractor. And we knew what their capabilities were. We knew what they were good at. And we asked Bath Iron Works leadership, would you partner with us and with Puritan to help them rapidly stand up machine tools and the plant and equipment necessary? And I was so pleased with Bath Iron Works' response to that. They said, absolutely, we're in. And I'm going to tell you, they set up all the machine tools with them and their supply base, set up all those machine tools so rapidly to start churning out a high number of nasal swabs. It was incredible to watch happen. So yes, we knew a lot about some areas, but we didn't know a lot about others. The other thing that we didn't understand very well was that financial fragility measurement. So as the IBC at the OSD level started to look at how are we going to invest this to the maximum benefit of COVID-19 response, because that's what Congress asked us to do in the CARES Act. And we looked at that very carefully against what are the mission fragilities, what are the defense and medical market fragilities, and then what are their financial fragilities. And we had to, as part of, again, back to mission-focused business leadership, understanding financials became extraordinarily important. And when you see the downturn in cash flow, the downturn, the layoffs that we started experiencing, applying the right business tools to that problem became very, very important. So DPA had its role to play, but we stayed very closely aligned to what Congress asked us to do, and it was all COVID impacted industrial base. But the other tools that we had to influence cash flow and influence revenue, we applied those as well outside of DPA funding. And for example, on the revenue side, when you're losing lots of jobs in different parts of the country, and I will tell you, the data analytics that we got on job losses was amazing. We were tracking job losses state by state by state, and we were looking at how do we invest in a way that rapidly provides relief to the American people, not just to the defense industrial base, small business, large business, all of it. And one of the things that we did in the Air Force, and I know the other services did as well, is accelerate existing pre-award contracting. And so $3.9 billion worth of contracting in the Air Force accelerated so that we could get revenue started with those companies immediately. Hello. And that made a huge difference to the revenue and to the jobs, making sure that we don't lose those jobs, or we can actually reverse the effects of losing those jobs.
Need to take a short break here, and when we come back, we'll talk more about lessons learned for the acquisition community from COVID-19 with Major General Cameron Holt, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Contracting at the U.S. Air Force. And I'm your moderator, Jared Serbu. This is On DoD on Federal News Network, sponsored by ProPricer.